Hey, good morning, guys. It is Wednesday, March 25th, and sorry for the late video upload. We had a department meeting this morning, so I was catching up with other science teachers and just kind of talking about what we're all doing and seeing what works and what doesn't. So that's why this video is getting on a little bit late today, but it's not going to be a super long one, so yeah, it shouldn't take too long. Today we're going to be moving into the next assignment, which is assignment number 2. Yesterday you guys should have added your assignment sheet and the notes for assignment 1 into your notebook already. If you haven't done that, you want to make sure you're keeping up with that. I did get some messages from people that didn't have printers. If you don't have a printer, no problem. Just try to be as creative as you can. You can always just draw in the assignment sheet yourself. Really, it's more about the formatting and just staying organized so that you're knowing where to find everything. Same thing goes with the notes. With today, we're going to continue with the resources that Miss Michaud has so graciously shared with us. So if you can't print it out, no problem. You can just kind of look at it on your screen and just make sure the words are actually at least getting in your notebook. And then if you want to, sketch out a little drawing, just so you have a visual in your notebook, feel free to do that. I know some of you guys are excellent artists. Before we start today, just a quick update. Right before I was making this, I did get a email from the district office. I don't know if you guys have seen it yet. It's not surprising news, but it is kind of official news. And again, I told you guys don't believe stuff unless it's coming from Ms. Lazinski or the district office or higher up, which would be San Mateo County, either health or Office of Education. So this notification actually comes from the San Mateo County Office of Ed, and they released it this morning, basically saying that our school closure is going to be extended at least till May 1st. That probably comes as no surprise to you if you've been keeping track of what's been going on. I would have been really surprised and probably really concerned if we were coming back after spring break. So after spring break, we are going to continue online. You're going to have a sub, Miss Reyes. She's awesome. I will get a video at some point, maybe at the end of this week, just to introduce you to her and she can say hi. But she'll be running things, after spring break for sure, maybe even earlier if my baby comes. Okay, so that's just the update. You can read this for yourself. I think you should be able to check your emails, but it's basically saying that we're extending things till May 1st. But again, this is all tentative, right? It could be further. We just kind of have to wait and see how we're doing in terms of flattening the curve and how things are doing in other parts of the country. So today's assignment, you're going to be, let me switch over here. We're going to be looking at, let me see if I can get this centered. How do I fix this? Let's see. Here we go. Center that. Everything got thrown off a little bit. There we go. That's better. So yeah, you're going to be downloading and printing out this worksheet. And again, if you don't have it, you can just do it directly in your notebook. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. Today's assignment lesson is all about energy transfer. I talked about this a little bit yesterday about how energy does not get recycled, right? In ecosystems and ecology, energy always moves in a single direction because once it's used, you can't really get it back. That doesn't mean that it's not important, though. We do want to understand how energy moves through an ecosystem so we can understand how the interactions that happen are so important. And so the name of this lecture is Energy Flow in Ecosystems. And sorry for the graphic picture, but that is real life. Things have to eat other things in order to get energy as well as nutrients. So the first thing you want to remember, this is something we've already drilled in quite a bit this year, is that all energy for life originally is going to come from the sun. Okay, and it doesn't matter if you're a carnivore or an herbivore, anything you eat and you get energy from, at some point you're going to be able to trace that all the way back up to the sun. If you think about a slice of pizza, right? Every ingredient on that pizza, the wheat comes from a plant, they get their energy from the sun. The cheese is coming from a cow, the cow's getting energy from grass gets its energy from the sun. Let alone the meat and all the other vegetables. So everything originally comes from the sun. We are, a solar-powered planet. Even if you're not made out of solar panels, one way or another, that energy is going to make its way to you. And so the way that energy moves is through a progression of what we call trophic levels. Okay, I don't know if it's on this slide, but the word trophic is actually it means feeding, or where you get your energy from. And so what you see here are every one of these boxes represents a trophic level, starting from the bottom and then working our way up. And basically the idea with this is that energy is being passed from one level to the next, to the next, to the next. So the bottom layer, the bottom level of every food web or every food pyramid, if you're familiar with those words, or food pyramid, that's for eating, that's in health class. Food web or food chain is always made up, the bottom level is always made up by what's called the producer, also known as an autotroph. Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. The producer gets its name because they're the first ones that can produce the food. So on land, that's mainly going to be the plants and photosynthetic bacteria. In the water, that's going to be an organism you might have heard of before called phytoplankton. They're a protist, algae and such, but they're going to be the ones and the only ones that can actually take energy from the sun and store that energy in chemical bonds to make food. And the main food for that, the main product of that photosynthesis is sugar. So we call them producers because they produce all of our food. They're also known as autotrophs. Auto means self, troph means feeding, so they can make their own food, they can feed themselves. They're not really relying on other organisms. As long as they can get the nutrients, as long as they're getting carbon dioxide and that energy from the sun, those are your major inputs for them to make their own food. Now above that, we have everybody else, which is referred to as a consumer. And they get their name because they can't make their own food. They have to consume something else to get that nutrients. Now, consumers are also known as heterotrophs. What does that mean? Well, hetero, you remember, means different, right? We saw that in the word heterozygous versus homozygous. So hetero meaning different, troph meaning feeding. Heterotroph means that they're feeding and getting their energy and nutrients from another organism. Which means they have to consume them. So the first level of consumer is called the primary consumer because they're the ones that eat the producer. Okay? What comes after that is the secondary consumer, and then the tertiary consumer, which if you're not familiar with that word, tertiary just means 3 or third. And then above that you have quaternary, which is 4. Now we're going to talk about this later, but most food webs or food chains cap out at that quaternary level, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason why it doesn't go beyond that. And before I go over it, maybe just take a second and think about why that is. So what you've seen here are these trophic levels, and what this represents is how energy enters living systems through the bottom, through those primary producers or autotrophs, and then the energy is converted from solar energy, light energy, into chemical energy, which is just a fancy way of saying sugar or food. And then after that, the consumers are heterotrophs that can't make their own food. They get their energy by eating other things, and the energy kind of works its way up through that food chain. Now, what you see here is an example of a food chain. I'll move my picture here to the side. A food chain is a model that shows the sequence of how energy is passed down from one organism to the next. It also shows how nutrients is passed down, right? Because when this grasshopper eats the flower, it's not only getting sugar for nutrients, it's also getting nitrogens and phosphoruses and many other atoms and nutrients that it needs to build its own body. So food chains are really simplified models to show how both energy and nutrients can move through a certain ecosystem. Okay? And so the arrows show the direction of that energy flow. Now you may be wondering what eventually happens to all the energy, right? Because if the quaternary consumer is the last one, does that mean all the energy ends with them? And the answer is no. Energy is going to end up leaving them and going somewhere. And I'll give you a little hint, right? Chances are right now it's kind of a cold day. If you take your hand and kind of put it under your shirt, you're going to feel something in there that's different than the air outside. That's where the energy is going to go. I'm not going to give it to you just yet. We'll talk about it in a couple of slides. So when you look at energy travel, an interesting thing is that energy transfer is always really inefficient. Okay, what that means is that we rarely ever have a case on Earth or in this universe where when energy is transferred from one place to another, 100% of the energy is transferred. Here's kind of a weird thing. I don't have an actual number, right? We could probably look this up, and if somebody wants to look it up and let me know on the comment section below, that'd be awesome. But when you buy a battery and you plug that into any device, whether it's a remote control or any battery powered device, what kind of sucks is that the energy in that battery, not 100% of energy is not going to be used to power that device, because when the energy is moved from the battery to your remote control or to I don't know, I guess there's not very many battery powered things now. I guess even your phone, right? But if you were using a battery, like, okay, I get an analogy now. You got your, those little charger packs, right? You're running out of battery on your phone. If you charge up that pack, and let's say it's got like 100 units of energy, when you plug that into your phone, it doesn't mean that your phone's going to get all 100 units of energy, because anytime we transfer energy, it's going to be inefficient. And how do we know that? Well, if you plug it in, when you feel both the charger and your phone, you'll notice that it gets warm, right? And what is warmth? That is the release of heat. So whenever we transfer energy from one place to another, a good proportion of that energy is actually lost in the form of heat. And that heat represents energy that isn't being used to charge up the phone battery, or isn't being used to do what you want it to do. That heat actually gets lost to the atmosphere, to the universe, and we don't really get that back. And living systems really are no different than that. So let's take a look at this caterpillar and see what's going on. He's eating this leaf here, okay? And energy, by the way, is measured in joules. You'll learn more about that in chemistry next year. And so let's say he eats 200 joules worth of leaves. Does that automatically mean that his body's going to store those 200 joules? Well, the answer is no. And the reason for that is because the energy goes to 3 places. Okay, and sorry, I got to figure out the best ratio for my screen here. Had it figured out, but something reset. Okay, now we can see everything. Sorry. So those 200 joules come in, right? So step 1, digestion is not efficient. Okay, whatever you eat, you're only going to be able to actually break down and absorb a certain portion of that. And in this particular case, you can see this little guy is going to actually poop out about 100 joules of energy, right? And you got to remember, feces is stuff that you never actually got. Okay, you didn't absorb that nutrients. You're not absorbing that nutrients and that energy. And when this caterpillar poops out that feces, there's 100 joules worth of energy in that feces that he never got. Right? And that means that what's actually absorbed with the energy the caterpillar is receiving is the other 100 joules. Now, how do I get that? You take 200, you subtract the amount of energy lost in feces, and now you have 100 joules of energy that's actually taken in. Okay. Now, does that mean that the caterpillar is now going to take that 100 joules of energy and store it into its body to make its muscles and its skins and its tissue? The answer is no, because the caterpillar has to use that energy to stay alive. Right? It's going to do this thing called cellular respiration. We've talked about this before. And so to make that ATP, to power its cells and stay alive and do mitosis and reproduce and grow and develop, the caterpillar is going to take the 100 joules of energy that it got from its food, and it's going to use 67 of those joules just to stay alive. Okay? And it's going to do cellular respiration, which means once you use the energy, it is gone. Okay? That's the dead end. And where does the energy go? Well, it gets used to power life, and then that also is going to release heat in the process. And I'll elaborate on that in a little bit. So we lose 67 joules in cell respiration, which means we only have 33 joules left over. And that's the only energy that's left for the caterpillar. When it's used up all the energy that needs to stay alive, the extra energy, now it gets actually stored into what we call biomass. That means that it's going to be stored as fat, as muscle, as tissue. And so really, when you think about this caterpillar, out of all the stuff that it eats, only 33 joules, okay, which in this case amounts to about 16%, right? 16% or so of that energy actually is stored in its body. Okay. Now, why is that so important for food chains? Because when this caterpillar, let's say, sorry for this guy, he gets eaten by a bird, the bird is not going to have access to these 200 joules of energy. Right? The bird's not going to eat the feces. The bird can't get the 67 joules that have already been used. The bird is only going to get what? Yes, the 33 joules of energy that it's stored in its body. And so when we talk about food chains and about energy moving from one level to the next, what you got to understand is that if you eat a hamburger today, okay, and you digest it and you use the energy and you store some of that hamburger in your body, and then tomorrow you get eaten by a bear, the bear is only going to get a really small proportion of that hamburger, because you've lost and used that energy in the form of feces and in cellular respiration. And that's why energy travel is inefficient. Okay, that's why when we go back to this food chain, we're going to see today in a couple of slides that as energy moves up from the producers to the primary consumer, and the primary consumer to the dairy consumer, and so on, we're going to lose energy all the way up, which means by the time it gets to the top, there's so little energy available left for another level to be added on. And that's kind of your hint for now as to why it caps out at 4 levels. Okay, if it were to go to the next level, you got to think about what would be necessary in terms of energy for that next level of predators to survive. And the reality is it's pretty hard for them to survive. So when we model all this and we were to graph all this out, you would get what's called an energy pyramid. And an energy pyramid shows not only the food chain on the side here, and here's we have a simple one, flowers being eaten by the grasshopper eaten by the mouse, and the mouse is eaten by the snake. But what it also shows is how much energy is available at each of those levels. Okay, and what you would expect is, of course, most of the energy is going to be available at the bottom level where the producers are, right? Because they're the ones doing photosynthesis. That's where most of the sugars are going to be stored. But because of this inefficiency, right? And we actually have a rule for this. It's called the 10% rule. What that means is that only 10% of the energy available at one level is actually passed on to the next, okay? Because of the energy in feces, because of the energy used up in cell respiration. So when this grasshopper eats all this plant material, only this amount, and we'll have some numbers in here, I think, but only the orange amount here will actually be stored in its body as biomass. And when that grasshopper gets eaten by the mouse, then the mouse will get even a smaller sliver of that energy, 10% of that. And then when the mouse is eaten by the snake, even a smaller amount is passed on. Okay. Now it doesn't mean that the snake can only live off this tiny sliver of energy. What that means is that out of all the original energy found in the plant, only this tiny little sliver is actually making its way to the snake. Okay, and so the snake, being a bigger animal, is going to have to eat a lot more just to get what it needs to survive. Here are some numbers to kind of just give you a visual. Here are your levels of production: primary producer, secondary. This is the producer. Then tier 2, the trophic second level, is your primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. In terms of energy, what does it look like when we apply this 10% rule? Well, let's say that the flowers, the plants, have 100,000 joules of energy. Let's do some quick math here, folks. How much energy would actually be passed on and stored in the body of the grasshopper? I'll give you a sec to think about that. Okay, well, what's 10% of 100,000? It's going to be 10,000. Okay. Then how much is going to be passed on to the mouse? Well, 10% of 10,000 is, that's right, 1,000. And that means the mouse is only in 1,000 of the original 100,000 joules of energy. Okay. And then applying that same concept to the snake is only going to get 100 joules of energy. So you can start to see why we cap out these trophic levels at 4 levels, because anything beyond that is going to mean that the next, if something eats that snake, like a hawk comes in, that hawk is only going to get 10 joules of energy from that snake, which means that hawk is going to have to eat a lot more snakes to stay alive. And that's one of the reasons why, if you look at populations of the top predators, right, and you compare them to the animals on the lower parts of the food chain, there's such a difference in the population size, right? In the water, think of like minnows or sardines. You'll see them by the millions, but how many sharks do you see? Well, not that many, right, in a given area. On land, right, you're gonna go to the forest and you'll see tons of mice, you'll see tons of insects, but as you work your way up the food chain, how many bears or wolves are living in that area? Very, very few. And the reason for that is because by the time the energy gets to them, there's so little left that there's only and they all have to still eat, right? So because of competition and limited resources, that's going to keep the population of those top predators pretty small, and there really isn't room for another predator to move in and add a 5th, 6th, or 7th level. So I hope that makes sense in terms of like the effect of this inefficiency on the size of populations, as well as the number of tiers in the energy pyramid. So here's some stuff to write down into your notes. Only 10% of the energy from a trophic level is passed on to the next level. And the reason for that is because most of the energy is lost in the form of heat. Now again, heat is related directly to cellular respiration. Okay? Anytime you burn fuel, whether it's sugar or gasoline in your car, a byproduct of that is going to be heat. And again, that heat just represents energy that was never actually made it to where you wanted it to go, right? So you'll eat 100 joules of sugar, break that down, but in that breaking down process, you may lose 30%, 40% of that to heat, and that's energy that you're not going to have to stay alive. That heat is lost And we try to capture it by wearing clothes, or animals will have fur or feathers to trap that heat. But ultimately, that heat's going to escape to the atmosphere, and it's gone, it's lost. So that's why we have that 10% rule. The way you can think about it is that 90% of the energy is lost in the form of heat or used in the process of cell respiration. And that's going to mean is that the number of organisms and the biomass is also going to decrease, generally speaking, by 90% at each trophic level. So that's why, again, the plant populations are always going to be highest in a given ecosystem, but as you get closer and closer to the top predators, the number of organisms, the number of predators is going to decrease. And that's going to limit the number of organisms there are at that level. We can also measure this in terms of biomass. If you were just to weigh the amount of, if you were just to weigh the amount of material, right, of plant leaves and stems, and then weigh the amount of grasshoppers or mice or snakes, you would also see that biomass decrease as you work your way up that food chain, again by 10% each time. Okay, and I also don't want to forget at the bottom here, there's this big yellow block. What does that represent? Obviously, that's going to be sunlight, right? So that represents, for our purposes, an infinite amount of energy available to plants, and then they're going to take a certain amount of that, turn it into food, and then it works its way up. Okay, and so here's a little review question then. Why are food chains made up at most of 4 or 5 levels? Why don't you take a few seconds, pause the video, and see if you can answer that. Okay, hopefully you got that. If that's not clear and it's not really making sense to you, just ask me during our live stream tomorrow. Okay? All right. I think we're getting close to the end. One of the last things we want to talk about is a food web. So a food chain is really nice. It's clean. It's easy to see how the energy moves through. But in real life, it's not realistic, right? In real life, we have many different interwoven food chains that exist. In this picture that we see here, you see a food web for a marine environment. And you can see that in real life, it's never like one organism only gets eaten by another, right? These small fish or these squid or these birds or these plankton down here, the things that are in the lower part of this food web, they can be eaten by a huge variety of different animals, of different predators that are in the 3rd, 4th levels of the food chain. And in the same way, if you are a predator like this elephant seal or a leopard seal, you're not only going to eat the fish, you're also going to diversify what you eat and be eating squid or birds and other animals. And we see that in ourselves too, right? I mean, you don't go home every day and just eat rice or only eat beans or only eat steak. We diversify our menu so that we can get different kinds of nutrients, but what also that means and what also that does for us is that in times of shortage, like right now, pasta and rice are sold out, right? People have been raiding and hoarding that stuff. Well, if you only ate rice and that's the only thing your body could digest and get energy from, you'd be screwed, you'd die off. But luckily, if we're out of rice, then we can get beans or we can get corn or we can eat wheat. The more diversity you have in the food that you can eat, the more likely you're going to survive. And that is on a human scale with in terms of grocery stores, but also in nature with ecosystems. And so in real life, we don't have these simple food chains. We have these food webs that show all the different pathways of how energy can move through an ecosystem. Now, it does always start with the producer. Okay, you still have to have the producers on the bottom, but then as it works its way up, you'll see that there's a lot of branching that takes place. And this is good because the more, it's kind of like with us in the grocery stores right now, the more pathways that you have for these organisms to get their nutrients, the more likely they're going to survive if there's some kind of disturbance to this ecosystem. And so what this shows is a really important word. Okay, you want to write this word down. The word is interdependency. Okay? Interdependency means that every single one of these species in this picture depends on another to survive and to manage their populations. Now, it's pretty easy to understand how the organisms at the top of the food chain depend on everybody else below them, right? But it does go the other way around too. And just a hypothetical thing to think about. If you were to, let's do 2 scenarios. If you were to kill off the fish down here at the bottom of the food chain, right? Who would that impact? Well, obviously that's going to impact everybody above it, right? If there's no fish, then the seals and the whales and everybody above it, they're going to, have to switch their diet to squids and birds, and that's going to create more competition. So that can affect the population size of the predators, and that's also going to start to put more pressure on the squid and the birds because they're going to be eaten at a higher rate because the fish are gone. So when you take something out of the bottom of the food chain, that's going to have a trickle up effect and affect the things that are up top, right? But the same can be said for the other direction. Let's say that we took out the elephant seals, right? Or we took out the leopard seals because we overhunted them, which we did back in the early 1900s and 1800s. Well, when you remove that predator, what does that do to the populations down below? Well, they're not being eaten anymore, right? Which means the fish and squid populations explode and the populations get really big. And at first you might think, oh, that's a really good thing, right? Because now there's tons of fish, there's a lot more food. But you got to keep in mind the fish themselves are relying on the things below them, like the plankton and the copepods and the krill and the phytoplankton. And so if the fish populations explode, they're eating up all the nutrients down here, and what's going to happen is eventually all the producers, their population crashes. They no longer do photosynthesis. There's no more food. And then what does that mean for the fish and everybody above it? That means they're going to die out too. Okay, so we want to move away from this idea that the predators are the only ones that matter in terms of getting their food, and that the food supply is the only thing that matters. What I'm trying to get at is everybody in this food web plays a role in keeping this balance. Okay, and in a way, we talked about the word homeostasis, right, for our body, of like keeping things as stable as possible. Well, we want to see a homeostasis, a balance of the system in nature. And whether you're looking at the rainforest or the ocean or the wetlands or a forest in Canada, it doesn't matter what kind of biome we're talking about, these food webs can be modeled for any kind of ecosystem. And what it shows us is how important we are not we are as humans, but how important it is to have that interdependency and to maintain that diversity. And so some things to think about are like, well, what's going on right now, right? What are we doing with the number of species? Well, we have extinctions, right? We're destroying habitats, we're overhunting, we're contributing to climate change, which a lot of these species can't adapt to. And the extinction rate right now is much higher than it was in years past. And so what does that mean when like some of these species go extinct and they disappear? Well, it's going to throw off this whole balance that has taken millions and millions of years to achieve. Okay, so food webs are a simple concept, but the implications of that, of what happens when the food web is disturbed, that is actually a lot more complex and super important to understand when we're talking about energy. So I think that is our last slide. And just to show you again, what you should have been doing is been filling out this sheet as we've been going through. And if you missed anything, keep in mind you got to fill in some numbers here. See if you can fill it out yourself, or you can just copy down the numbers from the video that I'm making here. And I know, again, I went kind of fast, but we are getting close to 30 minutes, so I want to end this. If you need anything that you missed, just go back and play that video, pause it as you need, and get that stuff filled out. Okay, I hope you learned something here. I hope that's helpful. Tomorrow we are going to be doing our live stream at the set time for each period. So 5th period I'll see you at 12:30, 6th period at 1:30, and 7th period at 2:30. And so check those links. You can also just, if you subscribe, you'll get a notification when the live stream starts. Yeah, come ready with questions, and I look forward to seeing you guys. All right, hope that's helpful. Have a great day. Bye.